The stars above Earth had always been silent, but on that cold November morning, they screamed with light as 3,000 alien warships tore through the fabric of space itself. Admiral Elena Vasquez stood in the command center of the United Nations Defense Council, watching the holographic display as ship after ship materialized in orbit around humanity's home world. And she felt her heart turn to ice in her chest. The vessels were massive beyond anything human engineers had ever dreamed of building. Each one a cathedral of black metal and glowing energy conduits that pulsed. With power older than human civilization itself, they arranged themselves in a perfect geometric pattern that the analysts would later call the crown of submission, a formation that the Valkyrie Dominion had used to accept the surrender of 11 species across 3 galactic arms over the past 10,000 years. Within the hour, every screen on Earth flickered and displayed the same image, a being of crystalline flesh that refracted light in patterns that made human eyes water and human minds feel small. This was High Arbiter Thexanel, the voice of the Dominion, the creature who had overseen the peaceful subjugation of more worlds than humanity had names for. His voice came through every speaker in every language simultaneously, a technological feat that demonstrated just how far beyond human capability these invaders truly were. Species designation, human. The alien began, his tone carrying the weight of absolute certainty. You have been assessed and found suitable for integration into the Valkyrie Dominion as a servitor-class species. Elena watched as people around her began to tremble, and she understood their fear because she felt it too, crawling up her spine like cold fingers. You will receive our terms of submission within the hour, Thexanel continued. You have 7 solar days to comply, and compliance is not negotiable, but rather the natural order of existence itself. The transmission ended, and chaos erupted across the globe in the hours that followed. Elena read the surrender document that the Valkyrie transmitted to every government on Earth. All 4,000 pages of it, and each page made her feel more sick than the last humanity would be reduced to a servitor species. Forbidden from space travel, forbidden from advanced technology, forbidden from weapons of any kind. The population would be optimized to 3 billion through forced sterilization, programs that would take effect immediately upon surrender. Human culture would be archived in Valkyrie databases and then systematically erased from living memory over 3 generations. Human children would be educated in Valkyrie doctrine and would learn to see their own ancestors as primitive creatures who had been saved from themselves by the benevolent Dominion. This was mercy, the document explained, because other species had received far worse treatment when they failed to recognize their place in the universal hierarchy. Elena sat alone in her office after reading every word, and she stared at the stars through her window, knowing that behind those distant lights sat an armada that could glass the Earth in hours if humanity refused. The governments of the world fractured into 3 factions almost immediately. The first faction wanted immediate surrender, because survival mattered more than pride, and living as servants was better than dying as defiant corpses. The second faction wanted to fight, to launch every nuclear weapon at the alien fleet, to die on their feet rather than live on their knees. Even if victory was impossible, the third faction simply collapsed into paralysis, unable to choose between extinction and enslavement. Frozen by the weight of an impossible decision, Elena belonged to none of these factions because she saw something that the others had missed in their panic. She had spent 30 years studying game theory, behavioral psychology, and every recorded first contact scenario that human science fiction had ever imagined. And something about the Valkyrie approach bothered her. They had sent no scouts before arriving. They had made no attempt to assess human military capability. They had demanded surrender before firing a single shot. as if the outcome was already certain in their minds. This was not the behavior of a military force preparing for battle, she realized, but rather the behavior of administrators processing paperwork. The Valkyrie were not warriors. They were bureaucrats with big ships. Elena stood before the emergency session of the Terran Defense Council, 3 days into the 7-day countdown, facing the most powerful leaders on Earth, who all looked at her with desperate eyes. "Let me talk to them," she said. And the room fell silent. The Chinese delegate spoke first, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Talk to them about what, Admiral? Because they have made their position very clear. I want to request a diplomatic summit aboard their command vessel," Elena replied, keeping her voice steady even as her pulse raced. "I want to negotiate face-to-face with High Arbiter Vexanel. They said compliance is not negotiable," the American president reminded her. "What makes you think they will even grant this request?" Elena smiled. "And it was not a pleasant expression, because I am not going there to negotiate." "Sir." The room stirred with confusion, and Elena continued before anyone could interrupt. "Every species they have conquered surrendered without fighting, which means they have a perfect track record of bloodless conquest spanning 10,000 years, she explained. "That kind of success creates patterns, and patterns create blind spots." She pulled up the transmission from Vexanel and froze it on his crystalline face. "Look at him," she said. "He is not afraid of us, and he is not cautious around us. And he is not even particularly interested in us beyond the paperwork we represent. He thinks this is already over. And species who think they've already won become careless with information." The council members exchanged glances, and Elena pressed forward. "I am not going to that ship to beg for mercy or to negotiate better terms," she declared. "I am going there to learn everything I can about who they really are, what they really fear, and what they have never faced before, because somewhere in that perfect 10,000-year record of victory, there has to be a weakness, and I intend to find it. High Arbiter." Vexanel received her request within the hour and granted it immediately. Amused by what he perceived as a doomed species begging for scraps of dignity before the inevitable end. He had done this 800 times before with 800 different species. And they always wanted to talk, and they always failed to change anything. But as Elena Vasquez boarded the shuttle that would carry her to the alien command vessel, she carried with her something that Vexanel had never encountered in all his millennia of conquest. She carried the stubborn, irrational, magnificent refusal to accept that the game was already over. The stars above Earth still burned with alien light. But Admiral Elena Vasquez looked up at them and felt something other than fear. She felt the first spark of hope. The shuttle carrying Admiral Elena Vasquez and her carefully selected team of 12 humans crossed the void between Earth and the Valkyrie command vessel in absolute silence. None of them spoke because there was nothing to say that could make this moment less terrifying or less important. Through the viewport, Elena watched the alien ship grow larger and larger until it filled the entire view. A mountain of black metal and pulsing energy that made human engineering look like children playing with toys. The vessel was called the Throne of Certainty, and it had witnessed the surrender of more civilizations than humanity had centuries of recorded history. Elena had chosen her team with extreme care over the past 2 days. There were 3 linguists who specialized in non-human communication patterns and body language analysis. There were 2 psychologists who had spent their careers studying how beings made decisions under pressure. There was a historian named Dr. Marcus Webb who had dedicated his life to studying colonial resistance movements and how conquered peoples had fought back against impossible odds. And there was one quiet man from DARPA named James Chun, who said very little and watched everything with eyes that missed nothing. The shuttle docked with a gentle thud. and the airlock hissed open to reveal a corridor of perfect black glass that seemed to absorb light itself. Valkyrie guards stood at attention along the walls, their crystalline bodies glowing with soft inner light. And they did not acknowledge the humans at all as the delegation walked past. This was intentional. Elena realized, because ignoring someone completely was a way of saying they did not matter enough to notice. The negotiation chamber at the heart of the ship was designed to break spirits. The ceiling rose so high that it disappeared into darkness above, and the floor was a single sheet of glass, beneath which swirled images of conquered worlds and kneeling species. At the far end of the chamber, upon a throne carved from what looked like compressed of starlight, sat High Arbiter Dex Anil. He was larger in person than he had appeared on the screens, nearly 4 meters tall, and his crystalline body refracted the chamber lights in patterns that made Elena's eyes hurt and her thoughts feel slow. This, too, was intentional. She understood, because the Valkyrie had evolved to produce light patterns that triggered submission responses in mammalian brains. Elena forced herself to keep walking forward, and her team followed close behind her. Admiral Elena Vasquez of the Terran Defense Council, Dex Anil, spoke, and his voice resonated through the chamber like a bell. You have requested this summit to discuss the terms of your species' integration into the Dominion. I have requested this summit to understand those terms fully before humanity makes its decision. Elena replied, keeping her voice steady. Dex Anil's form flickered with amusement. There is no decision to make, Admiral, because the outcome was determined the moment our fleet arrived in your system. Perhaps, Elena said, but my people have many questions about what integration means, and I believe you would prefer a smooth transition to a difficult one. The High Arbiter considered this for a moment, and then he gestured to a section of floor that rose up to form chairs sized for human bodies. Ask your questions, he said. I find it refreshing when a species seeks to understand rather than simply weep. Elena sat down and pulled out a tablet, pretending to consult notes while actually giving her team time to spread out and observe everything they could. High Arbiter, I have read the integration documents thoroughly, but I would like to understand the philosophy behind them, she began. Could you explain the Valkyrie concept of universal hierarchy? Dex Anil's crystalline body brightened with what Elena interpreted as pleasure, and she knew immediately that she had found his weakness. He liked to talk about himself. He liked to explain why the Valkyrie were superior. He had probably been waiting 10,000 years for someone to ask the right questions. The doctrine of universal hierarchy is the foundation of all Valkyrie civilization. Dex Anil began, settling into his throne like a professor beginning a favorite lecture. The universe is not chaotic, Admiral, but rather organized into natural levels of existence. And some species are simply meant to rule, while others are meant to serve. This is not cruelty, but rather cosmic order. And the Valkyrie recognized this truth before we even achieved space travel. When we encountered other species among the stars, we gave them a gift, the gift of understanding their place in this order. Elena nodded thoughtfully while Dr. Webb behind her took rapid notes. And how many species have you brought into the Dominion? 11 species across 3 galactic arms over 10,000 years. Dex Anil replied proudly. Each one recognized the logic of submission when presented with our terms. All 11 surrendered peacefully. Elena asked, making sure to sound impressed rather than calculating. Of course, the High Arbiter said. Resistance to overwhelming force is irrational. And while some species are less advanced than others, none are so primitive as to choose extinction over survival. James Chun from DARPA shifted slightly at this, and Elena caught his almost invisible nod. That is remarkable, Elena continued. 10,000 years without a single war. And I must admit that humanity's history is quite different in that regard. Yes, We have studied your species, Dexanal acknowledged. You are unusually violent for a mammalian species, with a history of conflict that our analysts found almost pathological. But this too will be corrected through integration. And within 3 generations, your descendants will wonder how their ancestors could have been so primitive. Elena leaned forward slightly. High Arbiter, I am curious about something, and I hope you will not find the question offensive. Ask. Dexanal commanded. What happens to species that refuse your terms entirely? Not to negotiate for better conditions, but to simply say no. The chamber fell silent, and Dexanal's crystalline form flickered with patterns Elena had not seen before. There are no such species, he finally said. As I explained, all rational beings recognize the logic of submission when faced with forces they cannot defeat. But hypothetically, Elena pressed, what would the Dominion do if a species simply refused to surrender regardless of the consequences? Dexanal made a sound that might have been laughter. Such a species would be irrational to the point of insanity, Admiral. And irrational species do not develop space travel or survive long enough to encounter us. Your question is like asking what we would do if a planet decided to orbit its star in the opposite direction. It is simply not how reality functions. Elena smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. I see, she said. Then you have never actually fought a war, have you? High Arbiter. The crystalline being went very still. War is what primitive species engage in before they understand the natural order, he replied. But there was something new in his voice that sounded almost like uncertainty. You have never had to fight because every species you have encountered made the rational choice, Elena continued. Your weapons are powerful, yes, but they are ceremonial, designed to intimidate rather than to actually be used. Your tactics are 1,000 years old because you have never needed to update them. Your entire civilization is built on the assumption that overwhelming force will always produce surrender. She stood up from her chair and looked directly into Dexanal's fracturing light patterns. But what happens, High Arbiter, when you meet a species that does not make rational choices? What happens when you meet a species that would rather burn than bow? The silence in the chamber stretched for a long moment, and Elena could see her words landing like physical blows against the alien certainty. You have made your point, Admiral, Dexanal finally said, and his voice had lost some of its resonance. But points are not weapons, and your species has 72 hours remaining to accept our terms. I suggest you use that time wisely. Elena nodded and signaled her team to prepare for departure. Thank you for your time. High Arbiter, she said, you have been most informative. As the human delegation walked back through the corridors of black glass, James Chan moved close to Elena and spoke in a whisper. I got everything I needed, he said. Their technology, their ship layouts, their drive signatures. All of it, and I got what I needed, Elena replied. They have never fought anyone who refused to play their game. They have no idea what is coming. The shuttle carrying Admiral Vasquez and her team landed back on Earth to a world that had already begun to give up hope across every continent. People were gathering in churches and temples and mosques, praying to gods who seemed very small compared to the alien armada hanging in the sky above them. Governments had started preparing surrender documents, and some leaders had already begun negotiating, privately with the Valkyrie for better, personal terms in exchange for encouraging their populations to accept integration. Peacefully, but Elena Vasquez walked off that shuttle, with fire in her eyes and information in her head that could change everything. She demanded an immediate classified session with the Terran Defense Council. And within 3 hours, she stood before the most powerful leaders on Earth in a bunker deep beneath the Swiss Alps. The Valkyrie are not warriors, she began without any introduction. They are administrators, bureaucrats who have built an empire not through conquest but through the simple mathematics of intimidation. The room stirred with confusion, and the Russian president spoke first. Admiral, we have seen their weapons demonstrations, and their ships could destroy our entire civilization in hours. Yes, they could, Elena agreed. But they never have, and they never will unless we force them to. Because actually using those weapons would break their entire system. She pulled up holographic displays showing the data her team had gathered aboard the Throne of Certainty in 10,000 years of expansion. The Valkyrie have never fought a single battle, she explained. Every species they have encountered has done the math and chosen surrender over extinction. This means their military is entirely theoretical, powerful on paper, but never tested in actual combat. James Chun from DARPA stepped forward to continue the briefing. Their weapon systems are 1,000 years old because they have never needed to improve them, he said. Their shields are calibrated exclusively against energy weapons because no species has ever attacked them with anything else. Their ship hulls are structurally elegant but fragile because they were designed for intimidation rather than survival. And their fold space drives, the technology that allows them to cross the galaxy in moments, have a critical vulnerability that they have never had to worry about. He pulled up a complex diagram showing the Valkyrie drive system. These drives require an extremely precise gravitational baseline to function safely, and any significant disruption to that baseline causes the drives to become unstable. How unstable? The American president asked. Unstable enough to turn each ship into a small star for approximately 3 seconds. James replied, and the room went very quiet. We cannot disrupt gravity, the Chinese delegate pointed out. That is not a technology humanity possesses. No, James agreed. But we can disrupt the gravitational baseline of our solar system by a tiny fraction, using technology we already have. Nuclear weapons, Elena said. Specifically, the coordinated detonation of our entire nuclear arsenal at precise points in space, creating electromagnetic pulses that will shift the solar system's gravitational signature by approximately 0.003%. That is almost nothing, the Indian Prime Minister said. It is almost nothing for us. Elena replied, but for Valkyrie fold space drives, it is the difference between safe operation and catastrophic failure. We could destroy their entire fleet without firing a single shot directly at them. The room erupted into chaos as leaders shouted questions and objections and demands for more information. Elena let them argue for several minutes before raising her hand for silence. I know what you are all thinking, she said. You are thinking that this is insane, that we would be gambling the survival of our entire species on an untested theory against an enemy we barely understand. And you are right, because it is insane, but that is exactly why it will work. She walked to the center of the room and looked at each leader in turn. The Valkyrie cannot comprehend a species that would choose annihilation over submission, she explained. Their entire worldview is built on the assumption that all beings will make the rational choice when faced with overwhelming force. They have never met a species that would rather die standing than live kneeling. They have never met a species that invented the concept of spite. They have never met a species that burned their own cities rather than let invaders have them, that poisoned their own wells, that chose mass suicide over slavery. They have never met humans. Dr. Marcus Webb stepped forward with his historical analysis. Throughout human history, occupied peoples have consistently chosen resistance, even when resistance was mathematically hopeless. He said, the Jewish rebels at Masada, who killed themselves rather than submit to Rome. The Russian scorched earth tactics that destroyed Napoleon and Hitler. The Vietnamese who fought the most powerful military on earth for decades and won through sheer refusal to give up. We are not a rational species, and we never have been. Elena nodded. The Valkyrie think they have already won because they cannot imagine any other outcome. But we are going to show them something they have never seen in 10,000 years. We are going to show them what happens when a species simply says no. The debate lasted for 6 more hours as leaders argued about the risks and the morality. And the sheer insanity of what Elena was proposing, some still wanted to surrender and take their chances with integration. Rather than gamble everything on a plan that might kill everyone, others worried about what would happen if the plan failed, and the Valkyrie decided to make an example of Earth. But slowly, one by one, the leaders began to understand what Elena had understood from the moment she sat across from High Arbiter Dexanal. Surrender was not survival, because the humanity that would exist after integration would not be humanity at all. Their culture would be erased, their population reduced, their children raised to see their ancestors as primitive animals who needed to be saved from themselves. That was not survival, but rather a slow extinction stretched out over 3 generations. And if humanity was going to go extinct anyway, then they might as well go extinct fighting. The vote was taken at midnight, and when the results were announced, Elena felt tears running down her face. Humanity had chosen to be irrational. The next 48 hours were a blur of activity as every nuclear power on Earth coordinated their arsenals for a purpose their creators had never imagined. Missiles were reprogrammed with new targets. Not cities or military bases, but precise points in empty space calculated by James Chun and his team. The timing had to be perfect, with every detonation occurring within milliseconds of the others to create the cascading electromagnetic effect that would shift a gravitational baseline. If even a few missiles failed or missed their targets, the plan would not work, and the Valkyrie would have all the justification they needed to reduce Earth to radioactive glass, but the missiles would not fail. Elena told herself, because humanity had spent 70 years perfecting the technology of atomic destruction. And now the technology would finally serve a purpose worth serving. As the final hours counted down, she stood alone on a balcony overlooking the Swiss mountains and looked up at the stars. Somewhere up there, High Arbiter Dexanal was waiting for humanity's surrender, confident in his 10,000-year winning streak, certain that the universe would continue to operate according to his expectations. He had no idea that the rules were about to change. He had no idea what humans were capable of when they decided that losing was preferable to giving up. Elena smiled at the stars, and it was a fierce and terrible smile. You wanted our surrender, she whispered to the aliens who could not hear her. Let me show you what humanity does instead. The 72-hour deadline expired at exactly midnight Greenwich Mean Time, and across the Valkyrie fleet, communications officers waited for the transmission they had received from 11 species before. They waited for the surrender. High Arbiter Dexanal sat upon his throne aboard the throne of certainty, his crystalline form glowing with patient confidence. Because this was simply how the universe worked, and how it had always worked. Species were given terms. Species did the mathematics. Species surrendered. And the dominion grew. It was as natural and inevitable as gravity. When the communication channel from Earth opened, Dexanal expected to see broken humans begging for mercy, perhaps requesting slightly better terms or more time to prepare their population for integration. Instead, he saw Admiral Elena Vasquez standing in what appeared to be a military command center, surrounded by officers and technicians and screens displaying data he did not immediately understand. High Arbiter Dexanal, Elena said, and her voice carried no fear at all. Humanity has carefully considered the terms you have offered for our integration into the Valkyrie Dominion. We have debated among ourselves, consulted our philosophers and leaders and common citizens, And we have reached a unanimous decision. She paused. And in that pause, Dex Anil felt something he had not experienced in 800 years. He felt uncertainty. We have a counteroffer, Elena continued. And she transmitted a single document to every ship in the Valkyrie fleet. The document was 1 page long, formatted in every human language simultaneously, and it contained exactly 1 word repeated in each language: nitrogen monoxide. Dex Anil stared at the document for several long seconds, his crystalline mind struggling to process information that did not fit any pattern he had ever encountered. "Admiral," he finally said, "I do not think you understand your situation, because refusal is not an option that exists for you. Your species has no weapons capable of threatening our fleet, no ships capable of escaping our blockade, no allies who will come to your aid. You have only 2 choices: surrender, extinction. Then we choose a 3rd option," Elena replied, and her smile was the smile of a predator. "We choose to teach you something you have never learned in 10,000 years of conquest. We choose to show you what happens when you threaten a species that does not care about mathematics." She gestured to someone off-screen, and Dex Anil watched as the humans around her began activating systems and speaking rapidly into communication devices. "What are you doing?" the High Arbiter demanded. "We are demonstrating our negotiating position," Elena answered. "Watch your sensors, High Arbiter, and learn." Across Earth, in missile silos buried beneath mountains and deserts and frozen tundra, 12,000 nuclear warheads launched simultaneously into the sky. Dex Anil watched the sensor data with growing confusion as the missiles rose from the planet's surface. Because they were not heading toward his fleet at all, they were heading toward empty space, toward coordinates that seemed completely random and meaningless. "Your weapons cannot reach us," he said, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Even if they could, our shields would deflect them without effort." "We know," Elena replied. "We are not aiming at you." The missiles separated from their boosters and continued on their precise trajectories, spreading across the solar system like seeds scattered by a gardener's hand. And then, exactly 3 hours and 17 minutes after launch, they detonated, not one by one but all together. 12,000 nuclear explosions, creating 12,000 electromagnetic pulses that rippled through space in a carefully calculated pattern. The effect was invisible to human eyes, but not to Valkyrie sensors. And across the fleet, alarms began to sound. "What have you done?" Dex Anil demanded. And now there was something in his voice that might have been the beginning of fear. "We shifted the gravitational baseline of our solar system by 0.003%, Elena explained calmly. "A tiny change, barely measurable by our instruments. But your fold space drives require a precise gravitational signature to function safely. And we just changed that signature across the Valkyrie fleet." Engineers were scrambling to recalibrate their drives, and the data they were seeing made no sense to beings who had never faced an enemy capable of attacking them in such an unexpected way. "Check your drive status, High Arbiter," Elena suggested. "I think you will find the readings quite interesting." Dex Anil checked, and his crystalline form fractured with shock. Every fold space drive in his fleet was showing critical instability. The kind of instability that preceded catastrophic failure. The kind of instability that turned ships into brief and terrible stars. "This is impossible," he whispered. "No," Elena corrected him. "This is human, and we are very good at finding ways to destroy things, including ourselves if necessary." She leaned forward, and her eyes were hard as diamond. "You have 2 choices now, High Arbiter, and I suggest you listen carefully because I will not repeat them. Your first choice is to withdraw from our solar system immediately and return to wherever you came from, leaving humanity alone forever. If you choose this option, We will allow your drives to stabilize enough for you to escape before we trigger another gravitational shift. Your second choice is to stay and try to call our bluff. If you choose this option, we will detonate our remaining nuclear weapons and collapse every drive in your fleet simultaneously. Your ships will die. Your crew will die. You will die, and humanity will inherit the wreckage. We will take your technology, learn your secrets, find your homeworld, and show the rest of the galaxy what happens to those who threaten us." She smiled again, and it was the smile of someone who had already accepted death and found it liberating. "We are not a rational species, High Arbiter, and we never have been. We are the species that invented spite, that burned our own cities rather than let enemies have them, that chose mass suicide over slavery. We are the species that will destroy everything we have built if it means taking you down with us. So make your choice." The silence stretched across the void between Earth and the Valkyrie fleet. And in that silence, Dexanel understood something that shattered his 10,000-year worldview. The humans were not bluffing. He could see it in the Admiral's eyes. In the set of her jaw, in the calm certainty of her voice, she would do it. And she would feel no regret. And she would die with a smile on her face, knowing that she had taken his entire fleet with her. This was not rational. And it was not sane. And it was not anything that any species should ever be capable of. But humans were capable of it. And that made them the most dangerous beings Dexanel had ever encountered. "Admiral Vasquez," he said slowly. And his voice had changed completely from the condescending tone he had used before. "The Valkyrie Dominion formally withdraws its demand for human surrender. We will depart your system immediately and make no further contact with your species." Elena nodded, her expression showing no triumph and no relief. "Only cold satisfaction. A wise choice, High Arbiter. But understand this. If you ever return, if any Valkyrie ship ever enters our solar system again, we will not negotiate. We will simply destroy you. Because now you know what we are capable of. And now you know that we are not afraid to use it." Dexanel bowed his crystalline head, a gesture of respect he had never offered to any species before. "We understand. Admiral, humanity has taught us something we did not know we needed to learn. We will not forget the lesson." The Valkyrie fleet began its withdrawal, drive stabilizing just enough to allow fold space travel, ships disappearing one by one into the void between stars and on Earth. Elena Vasquez finally allowed herself to breathe as she watched the last alien vessel vanish from sensors. They had done it. They had faced the void and refused to blink. They had looked extinction in the eye and said no. Around her, the command center erupted into cheers and tears and embraces as the realization spread that humanity had survived the impossible. But Elena did not celebrate, because she knew that this was not the end. The Valkyrie would return eventually. And when they did, humanity needed to be ready. The galaxy had just learned that humans existed, and it had learned what humans were capable of. Now humanity needed to show them what else they could do. 3 years passed since the day humanity told the Valkyrie Dominion to leave and never come back. In those 3 years, Earth transformed itself more rapidly than in any previous period of human history, because the galaxy now knew that humans existed, and humans needed to be ready for whatever came next. The first year was spent studying the wreckage that the Valkyrie retreat had left behind. Damaged probes and jettisoned equipment that contained technology centuries ahead of anything human scientists had ever imagined. By the end of that year, humanity had built its first faster-than-light ship, a rough and ugly vessel that bore no resemblance to the elegant Valkyrie designs, but worked reliably and could be mass-produced. The second year saw humanity's first steps beyond the solar system. Exploratory missions to nearby stars to discover both wonders and dangers among the cosmos. They also discovered something else. the ruins of civilizations that had been absorbed by the Dominion. Entire species reduced to servants who had forgotten they were ever free. The third year brought rumors from the edges of explored space. Whispers carried by merchants and refugees and escaped slaves that the Valkyrie Dominion was fracturing. Word of humanity's defiance had spread across the galaxy like wildfire, passed from one subjugated species to another through forbidden channels and secret networks. For the first time in 10,000 years, the conquered peoples of the Dominion knew that resistance was possible. For the first time, they knew that the Valkyrie could be beaten. Slave revolts erupted on a dozen worlds, uprisings that were quickly crushed but never completely extinguished, fires that kept reigniting no matter how many times the Dominion tried to stamp them out. The doctrine of universal hierarchy, the foundation upon which the entire Valkyrie civilization rested, had developed cracks that could not be repaired, because if one species could refuse, then refusal was possible, and if refusal was possible, then the natural order was not natural at all. Elena Vasquez had retired from military service after the first year, her body too exhausted from the stress of saving humanity to continue fighting. But she had been appointed Secretary General of the newly formed Terran Federation, a position that allowed her to shape humanity's approach to the galaxy they were now part of. She was sitting in her office on a spring morning when her assistant informed her that a Valkyrie diplomatic vessel had entered the solar system requesting permission to approach Earth. Elena stared at the report for a long moment, memories of that terrifying week flooding back through her mind, and she approved the approach and began preparing for a meeting she had known would come. Eventually, the Valkyrie ship that descended through Earth's atmosphere was nothing like the warships that had threatened humanity 3 years ago. It was small and elegant and carried no weapons that human sensors could detect. And the being who emerged from it was not the towering and arrogant High Arbiter who had demanded humanity's surrender. Dexanel was smaller now, his crystalline form configured for conversation rather than intimidation. His light pattern soft and almost humble. Elena met him in a conference room with no black glass floors, no impossible ceilings, no thrones of compressed starlight, just a table with chairs on both sides. Equal seating for equal parties. Admiral Vasquez, Dexanel began, then corrected himself. Secretary General Vasquez, I thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I almost did not agree, Elena replied honestly. There are many on Earth who believe we should have destroyed your ship the moment it entered our system. I understand, Dexanel said. And I would not have blamed you if you had, because the Dominion has given your species no reason to trust us. Then why are you here? The crystalline being was silent for a moment, his light patterns shifting in ways that Elena had learned to recognize as deep thought. Your species has caused us considerable difficulty, he finally said. Good. Elena replied without hesitation. Dexanel made a sound that might have been laughter. Yes, I suppose we deserved that response, Secretary General. I have come to propose something that the Valkyrie have never proposed to any species in our history. Not integration, not submission, not hierarchy. I have come to propose partnership. Elena leaned back in her chair and studied the alien who had once threatened to erase her entire civilization. Why should we ever trust you? She asked. You should not trust us. Dexanel admitted. Trust must be earned, and we have done nothing to earn yours. But I can offer you something else. Explanation. He shifted his form, and Elena saw something in his light patterns that looked almost like pain. For 10,000 years, the Dominion operated on a single principle, that the universe was naturally ordered into rulers and servants, and that our role was to help species find their proper place in that order. We believed this completely, because every species we encountered confirmed it by surrendering. We thought we were doing good, bringing order to chaos. giving lesser species purpose and direction. We were wrong. You showed us that we were wrong when you refused to play the role we had assigned to you. You showed us that submission was not natural, but chosen, and that some species would rather die than make that choice. In the years since, as our conquered peoples have risen against us inspired by your example, we have been forced to reconsider everything we thought we knew, and we have discovered something that shames us. The species we subjugated were not inferior at all. They were simply peaceful, and we mistook their peace for weakness. We were the weak ones, because we could not imagine a universe where our way was not the only way. Elena listened without interrupting, watching the alien who had transformed from conqueror to something she did not yet have a name for. The Dominion is changing. The Exanal continued. Not quickly, and not without resistance from those who still cling to the old ways, but changing nonetheless. We are freeing the species we enslaved, returning their worlds and their futures and their futures. It will take generations to undo the harm we have done, and some of that harm can never be undone. But we are trying, and we have come to you, the species that taught us this lesson, to ask for something we have never asked before. We ask for negotiation, true negotiation, where both parties may refuse, where both parties may walk away, where neither party must submit. We ask for the chance to learn from you how to be something other than what we were. Elena was quiet for a long time, thinking about everything humanity had suffered and everything humanity had overcome. She thought about the terror of those first days when alien ships filled the sky and surrender seemed inevitable. She thought about the impossible gamble they had taken and the impossible victory they had won. She thought about the species across the galaxy who were now fighting for their freedom because one small blue planet had refused to kneel, and she thought about what humanity could become if they chose vengeance over wisdom, if they became conquerors themselves, if they repeated the mistakes of the Valkyrie High Arbiter. She finally said, "Humanity will negotiate with you, not because we trust you, and not because we forgive you, but because we believe in second chances. We believe that species can change, that old enemies can become new allies, that the future does not have to be defined by the past. We will negotiate, and it will be difficult. And there will be times when both sides want to walk away. But we will keep trying, because that is what humans do." Vexenal bowed his crystalline head. "Thank you, Secretary General. May I ask you something?" "Ask." "When you stood aboard my ship 3 years ago and asked me what would happen if a species refused to surrender, did you already know what you were going to do?" Elena smiled. And it was the same fierce smile she had worn when she told him no. "I knew from the moment. I read your surrender terms that humanity would never accept them. I did not know how we would refuse or what would happen when we did, but I knew we would refuse, because I knew what we are." "And what are you?" Elena stood up and extended her hand to the alien, a gesture of greeting that humans had used for thousands of years. "We are the species that does not quit. We are the species that fights even when fighting is hopeless. We are the species that would rather burn than bow. And we are the species that believes the galaxy can be better than it is." Vexanal took her hand in his crystalline grasp, and for the first time in 10,000 years, Valkyrie and humans stood as equals. "Then perhaps," he said quietly, "the galaxy is fortunate that we found you. Perhaps you will teach us all to be better than we are." Elena shook his hand and felt the weight of history shifting around them. "Perhaps we will," she said, "but you will have to do the hard work yourselves, because humanity can show you the door. Walking through it is up to you." The negotiations that followed lasted 6 months and were the most difficult diplomatic effort in human history, but they succeeded. And when the treaty was signed, it was not a document of submission, but of genuine partnership. The galaxy would never be the same. And it had all started with one word that humanity had spoken into the void. One word that had echoed across the stars and into the hearts of every enslaved species in the Dominion. No, the most powerful word in any language, the word that changed everything.